What's up guys, my name is Ace, and by now you've probably heard the news that XDefiant is shutting down. This was announced early in the week by Mark Rubin, and I know many of you guys have been asking me to make a video on this, and instead of just rushing out a quick initial thoughts video where I'd basically say, this really sucks, I feel really bad for the team, I wish XDefiant would thrive because I think competition is a very good thing and a healthy thing for the industry, but at the end of the day, it was never going to be my primary game, and I'm primarily interested in playing and covering Call of Duty. So unfortunately, I can't really complain when they're shutting down when I haven't been playing the game, I haven't been covering the game. That's essentially the main points I would have made if I just made a quick video on that, but instead I wanted to take a little bit more time with this video and sort of analyze the situation and share the top reasons that I feel XDefiant didn't make it. Now obviously this is just from my perspective, the way I see the situation based on my own experiences, as well as just keeping in touch with the XDefiant community as much as I reasonably could. And the idea behind this is mainly just learning lessons from it. If I were to make my own game, what lessons would I learn from the XDefiant situation here? And obviously, I don't think this just comes down to one primary reason that killed the game. I think it's a combination of several factors, and I pulled out what I consider to be the top 9 factors. And each of them will vary in how much of an impact I feel they had on XDefiant shutting down. So let's dive into it in no particular order. Honestly, the first reason is I think they missed the prime launch window for the game. I think the hype for XDefiant was really starting to build right around the second half of the life cycle of Modern Warfare 2, because many people were not happy with how that game was turning out and how it was being supported by Infinity Ward, and many people, myself included, would have loved to have an alternative to jump to. And XDefiant would have been a great alternative at that moment. However, that's when the delays really started to hit, and they didn't end up launching until the year after, when their target audience was now largely happy with the current Call of Duty game. Now, I obviously can't speak for everybody. I know a lot of people also didn't like that game. But again, from my perspective at least, there were fewer people that were actively seeking alternatives from Call of Duty, which did appear to be XDefiant's target audience, and we are going to be coming back to that point quite a bit throughout this video. So that's the first factor, and I really do wonder how things would have played out with XDefiant if they would have been able to launch in spring or early summer of 2023, when I think far more people would have been willing to jump ship from Call of Duty over to XDefiant. Next, one of the biggest reasons, especially early on, that I think XDefiant lost a ton of its momentum is the connection issues. I know early on this was the #1 reason that I was seeing people leaving the game that were otherwise enjoying it, and they would have stuck around, but they just couldn't take it anymore. The connection experience was awful for them, and they left. And unfortunately, many of them never came back to see that they did make some improvements to this over time. Now, I'm not going to claim the connection experience ended up being perfect with XDefiant, but at least in my experience, it definitely improved drastically compared to the launch window of the game. But unfortunately, I think it took them a little bit too long to get this into a noticeably better state. And because of that, they did lose a lot of their initial player base. And I think this was really made worse by the fact that the game got delayed for so long because of netcode issues. And so I think many people had the expectation that netcode would be at least in a decent place at launch after all these delays, and that unfortunately wasn't the case. Moving on to the next thing I have on my list here, this is their progression systems. I feel like the progression systems not only weren't very great at launch, but they weren't nailed down super hard. And that's a really big issue when you now have to suddenly make sweeping changes to how you're handling progression once the game is already out and once people are already engaging with the system and working toward progressing, without making people feel as though they've been cheated because they were working toward the previous progression system. Or maybe they achieved something the really hard way with the old progression system and now you made it significantly easier so other people are able to get that same achievement with a lot less effort than you did. I also remember at launch when it came to weapon leveling and especially unlocking attachments for your weapons, which are very important in XDefiant. With the way they initially handled it right at launch, it took so long just to get some basic attachments on your gun in order to compete appropriately with the people that did have all of the attachments unlocked on their gun. And that created a pretty big gameplay discrepancy between players that have grinded versus those that haven't grinded. And this is something they did end up addressing after a couple updates. They made that much more reasonable, but then they had to make some adjustments to how they handled how you were unlocking your camos. And it was a bit of a mess, and even after all of that got sorted out, I think they got that part into at least a better state. The overall progression system in the game, especially the long-term progression systems, in my eyes, they just weren't engaging enough. When it came to player progression and player leveling, it was just a number that ticked up next to your name. And then when it came to the main long-term grind, this is grinding for camos on your weapons. And with XDefiant, the way you get your camos on your weapons is you just use the weapon a lot. There's no specific challenges. There's nothing that really keeps you engaged on a game-to-game basis where you're specifically working towards some goal. It's basically just use this weapon a lot and you will get a camo for this weapon. And in the meantime, you'll have a number that ticks up next to your name. And for some people, that's totally fine. But for many, especially Call of Duty players, that's just not enough, and they need something that's a little bit more engaging to hook them and keep them coming back game after game, and I think XDefiant missed the mark in this area. And this actually segues nicely into my next point here, and this is, it was very clear from the beginning that XDefiant was targeting the Call of Duty player base. That was a huge part of their target audience. However, the game itself deviated too much from what many Call of Duty players look for and what many Call of Duty players love about Call of Duty. And one of those aspects is that previous point we were just talking about. Call of Duty players expect a lot of engaging challenges that you're working for on a game-to-game basis. So at any given time, you have tons of very specific gameplay-related challenges, very specific things that you're trying to do with your gameplay in order to complete these challenges, and XDefiant really didn't scratch that itch for many Call of Duty players. Additionally, when it comes to the very big differences here, when targeting the Call of Duty player base, XDefiant was a hero-style shooter, where the abilities really came into play. It would often disrupt the pace of play, it would create unwinnable situations, and there would often be a pretty big imbalance in individual gunfights and situations depending on the hero that you were using. And for many Call of Duty players, that was an immediate turnoff. What many people like about Call of Duty is it's basically my gun versus your gun. And sure, we have perks that maybe support certain playstyles to a degree, but they're not the same thing as these big abilities that can be absolute game changers. Additionally, we had characters with different health values, for instance. And like I said, for many people, especially from the Call of Duty fan base, this was just a big turnoff with the game, and they might have liked other aspects of the game, but the abilities were just too much for them and not really what they look for in a game. And this is why, right from the beginning, the first time I even came in to consult for XDefiant, which is well before it was even publicly announced, I always knew that no matter how good this ended up being, it would never be my main game. It would never take over Call of Duty for me, simply because I'm not really that into hero-style shooters. I can put up with it if the gameplay underneath it is really good, but it's not something that I really love and look for in a shooter, and I know many other Call of Duty players felt the same way. On top of that, another thing that I know many Call of Duty players, as they were playing, felt was missing, this is a lack of a feeling of reward for really popping off as an individual. That's something that Call of Duty does very well with their kill streak or score streak system, and obviously not every shooter needs to have a system like this, but when you're targeting that audience that's really into it, I feel there should have been some better rewards in place for going on a streak, for instance. Even if it's just collecting something like medals or some kind of accolade that doesn't apply to your gameplay at all, so you're not actually calling in streaks, but you get something that you can really keep track of over time. And really, the only reward we ever got for going on long streaks in XDefiant was massive XP boosts in the Team Deathmatch game mode. That was it, unfortunately. So there we go. As a big general topic, I do think this is one of the bigger reasons that XDefiant wasn't as successful as it could have been. They seem to have a very specific target audience, and the game didn't appeal to that audience as much as it probably should have. Next up, something that I personally don't care about that much, but I have seen a lot of people mentioning this, so it's clear that many people had an issue with this. This is their general cosmetics and art direction with the game, especially the paid-for cosmetics. It just didn't seem to land well with the player base. A lot of it was like a little bit too goofy. The color palettes were often just so crazy and out there. And with this being a free-to-play game that relies on the monetization from these cosmetics, when that cosmetic style isn't really appealing to your audience, that's obviously going to cause some pretty big issues as far as your revenue stream goes. And perhaps XDefiant would have been more successful, at least monetarily, and therefore kept going a little bit longer, if they had more appealing cosmetics that their audience really wanted to engage with and buy more than they did with what we got. In either case, on to the next topic. This is the general controller feel. For many people, this game just didn't cut it. It didn't hold a candle to Call of Duty's controller feel. And fair enough, this is something Call of Duty does exceptionally well with. The game just feels so good and natural with a controller in your hands. And XDefiant, I feel, never really matched that. Now, it's something that I found if you put the time in and get used to it, it was actually fine. I really did get used to the controller feel of XDefiant. There would always be that little transition period. It would take me a few games to get my XDefiant thumbs back on after playing Call of Duty for a while. And then when I switched back to Call of Duty, it would take a while to get my Call of Duty thumbs back on. But especially at first, it was a really awkward feeling getting used to XDefiant that just didn't feel natural. And I do think that led to a very bad first impression for a lot of controller players out there. After that, let's talk about their content release schedule. This is something I have talked about in the past. With XDefiant, they decided to go the route of very consistent content over time, but really spread out rather than coming all at once for a big update. And on paper, thinking about it, that seems like a reasonable approach to keep your players happy over time. You just continue to add content over and over again, and that should keep your player base quite happy. The problem is, I think that only keeps the player base that sticks around constantly day after day, week after week. it keeps them happy, but for many of the people that get kind of bored with the game, they fall off, drip feeding content out like that is often not enough to really draw those players back in, compared to a very large update with tons of new content that really attracts the attention of a lot of those players, and they think, hey, I gotta go back and check XDefiant out. They just had this huge update drop and a lot of new stuff to play around with. I want to come check it out. That never really happened with this game, and even with the launch of a new season, unfortunately, it didn't really feel all that big. It's like, okay, there's a new map, a new faction, which was probably the biggest part of a new seasonal launch. There are new guns in the battle pass, but many of these, at least with the playtime I had, it's either going to take me several weeks before I'll ever get to use them, or for the really late unlock ones, with my playtime, I never even got close to unlocking those throughout a season, so I would see that gun and it's like, well, I guess I'll be able to use that next season when there's an easy challenge to unlock it. And that kind of stuff really took a lot of the hype away from the launch of a new season. It didn't feel like a huge, major update with a bunch of brand new things to try out, and I really feel it should have been, and if they would have gone that route, I think they would have had a better chance of bringing players back into the game that had maybe dropped off and hadn't played the game in quite some time. And for many of those players, maybe they would have been really pleasantly surprised with all the little improvements that have been taking place, like the netcode improvements, for instance. After that, for number 8 on my list here, there were a ton of features that were promised that never arrived, or they just came way too late. So I'm talking things like kill cams, a traditional Call of Duty Prestige style progression system, persistent lobbies if you were only searching for a single mode. That was something that was promised early on and that never came, or at least since the last time I played it, which was about a month and a half ago, that wasn't there. Also, calling card challenges, that was another thing that was promised, and that would have provided potentially a whole lot of extra retention that we talked about earlier. But again, as far as I'm aware, that never came. And then there's like private matches, for instance. That's just a small list of some of the promises that were made that never ended up coming to the game. Now, I totally understand they didn't have the biggest team working on this. I'm guessing there was a ton of pressure to meet certain deadlines, so I get why they couldn't necessarily get all of these features ready for launch. There was probably a whole lot of pressure from up top that like you have to release this game, even if you don't have all these things in place. But at the end of the day, that doesn't matter from a player's perspective. If the players here were working on this feature and it's an exciting feature that we're really looking forward to, and months later there's still no updates or news on this feature, that's going to understandably upset many people and potentially turn them away from the game. And on one hand with this, I also think it's great that they were so engaging with the community, and if the community asked for something like kill cams, they straight up answered, we're working on it, and they were working on it in the background. But I think sometimes when it comes to features like this that are going to be taking months and months and months to get together, perhaps they should be kept quiet until they get closer to being ready to go, or some better expectations should be set as far as what the timeline would be on this. Although then if you are setting those expectations and then it turns out that it's more complicated and takes longer than you expected, then you're going to get a lot of backlash for not meeting that deadline that you set. So I get that it's kind of a tricky situation and you want to be open and upfront with the community about what's going on. But like I said, at the end of the day, from a player's perspective, all that matters is you were promised something and they keep mentioning this feature is coming and yet it doesn't arrive. And that feeling sucks. Now, moving on to another relatively small point, I don't think this one was absolutely a huge reason that the game didn't make it, but I do think the game would have had a better shot, at least on PC, if it would have launched on Steam. I know a lot of people despise Ubisoft, they won't download Ubisoft Connect, and they otherwise would have checked out XDefiant. If it was available on Steam, they would have checked it out. But it wasn't there, so it didn't quite have the same reach that it could have had, at least on PC. Obviously, this wouldn't have affected how things went on console, and it still did fail on console as far as we can tell, so I don't think this would have totally turned the situation around, but it's probably at least a small contributing factor. And this leaves us with the final point that I purposely saved for last here. This is the fact that the game had literally zero skill-based matchmaking outside of the welcome playlist, and combined with that, it had quite a high mechanical skill gap. Now, I want to be clear with this one, I don't think this was the primary reason the game failed. I know some people do think that's the case, and that's totally fair, but I do think the game could have succeeded even with no SBMM. However, I do think having literally zero SBMM did contribute to the decline of XDefiant to a noticeable degree. Now, I know no SBMM was one of the biggest selling points for the game. It attracted a ton of attention, especially from those frustrated by Call of Duty's modern matchmaking systems. Myself included, I was really excited to get back into that. And for me, at least, it actually felt great. It's one of the things I loved about the game most. It felt really organic, and it really felt like you would perform at your skill level relative to the general player base. If you were an above average player, you would be performing above average most of the time. If you were a below average player, you'd be performing below average most of the time. But as you improved, you would see that improvement reflected in your performance over the long term. And it wasn't a crazy whiplash experience, it just felt organic. Even when you got a really tough match, I wouldn't really get annoyed with that because I knew it was an organic thing and the game just put me in the best connection lobby it could find for me. And if I have a hard time in those tough lobbies, that's totally fine because I know an algorithm didn't specifically put me there because it's trying to decide what my experience is going to look like. Having said that though, I do think having 0 SBMM was a mistake. And I have been saying this from the beginning that I am not opposed to a little bit of SBMM just to protect the lowest of low skill players from the highest of high skill players. I think in order for a game to really grow and thrive and bring in new players over time, there does have to be some level of protection, especially these days where the general FPS experience and skill level is significantly higher than it was like 15 to 20 years ago with the golden age of Call of Duty. Top that off with the second point I mentioned, XDefiant has quite a high mechanical skill gap, and if you put a brand new player against a really good XDefiant player that has like 20 years of Call of Duty experience under their belt, well, unfortunately, that low skill player is going to get stomped so hard, they won't even be able to comprehend what the other player is doing and learn from that because it's just so far above their current experience level and their skill level. And that will cause them to simply leave the game as soon as they're out of the welcome playlist. And that was the topic I saw come up a lot. Many people were claiming they had a great experience in the welcome playlist, and the moment they leveled out of that, the game just became horrible and totally unplayable for them. They couldn't keep up, they couldn't even get a single kill, and they're not going to sit around and just be cannon fodder for the really good players out there. So this is why I feel some form of SBMM would have been helpful for this game. However, definitely not the modern SBMM or engagement optimized matchmaking systems that we see in games like Call of Duty, and many other games are using this now as well. They could have gone that route. They could have gone with a more traditional SBMM system from Call of Duty, where it did offer some protections for those really low skill players, and it would try to prevent the lowest of low from playing against the highest of high, but generally speaking, it wouldn't feel like your game was being manipulated. And on a game-to-game basis, things would feel reasonably consistent over time. In my eyes, that would have been a much better approach, and I think it would have prevented many of those lower skill players from dropping off the game in the numbers that they did. And as much as I hate the modern matchmaking systems we see in other games, I can definitely acknowledge that no SBMM was also a mistake. And even just a little bit of protection, I think would have gone a long way. And that's gonna wrap it up for the top 10 reasons that I feel XDefiant didn't make it. And it is really unfortunate that this is the case. I think the more competition we get in this space, the better. And I really wanted to see XDefiant thrive and hold its own. I always thought it would be an excellent second game to go to. If I was ever getting bored of Call of Duty, for instance, I really did enjoy popping into XDefiant from time to time. And while this video has really been about taking a critical look at the failures of XDefiant, I do want to be clear that I really enjoyed my playtime with this game. And I think one of the biggest things that I loved about XDefiant was the general map flow and spawn design was excellent. And it really did feel like older Call of Duty games when it comes to those specific areas. And that's something I've been missing a lot with more modern Call of Duty games, where they either totally screw up the spawn system, or the movement gets way too crazy, or the maps are getting shrunk too much. XDefiant, I feel, really nailed those areas. And that, combined with the organic feeling matchmaking, is what really kept me coming back for more with XDefiant, and I'm gonna miss those elements. And with that, I am really curious to hear from you guys in those comments down below. First off, how are you guys feeling about the fact that XDefiant didn't make it and it will be shut down? And second, do you guys agree with the list of reasons that I provided today? Do you think these are the primary reasons that the game failed? Or do you think maybe I missed something here? Do you think there's other big reasons that led to the failure of XDefiant? Just let me know down below. If you enjoyed the video, a like rating is always appreciated. And don't forget to subscribe for more if you haven't already. I'll talk to you guys next time.